All right, welcome to the video on lab expectations. So in this video, I am going to be discussing aspects I'm going to be looking for in the lab write-ups. So just some general specifics. First off, there's not going to be a minimum page or word count. It's as long as you get all of the information I'm asking for included, that is enough for me. With the audience, we need to think about who we're writing this lab report for. And so for that, what you're going to be doing is writing it for your fellow Physics 129 classmates. Let's pretend for the sake of writing it, they are up to date. They're roughly in the same area we are. So what you can do is we can use physics jargon. We can use some of the key terms and ideas. However, if it is a key aspect of what we're going to be looking at for that particular lab, you might want to explain it in detail. So for example, early on we're going to be talking about speed. So because that's the key aspect of one of the lab reports, that will be something that you would need to explain. But later on in the class, after we've seen speed a couple of different times, you wouldn't need to explain it in as much or any detail at all. Language, commonly for scientific writing, you're not allowed to use the first person, so I, me. However, I'm not going to be picky about that in this particular class. I just want you to practice some key aspects. Something else to note is that you are not always going to be writing a full lab report. I will at the top of every lab, there's going to be a blank page, or it's going to be mostly blank, and at the top it's going to say what to turn in. And it'll tell you, hey, you're turning in this part of the lab. So for lab 0, which is today, you're going to be turning in a table. So you're going to create a table, and you're going to have to turn in the answers to some questions in complete sentences. That's all you're going to be turning in. I'm not expecting you to go through and write up a full lab report for this. So these are the parts of a lab report that we are going to be looking at. So title, names, abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. And this is how I have the points set up. So it's out of 20 points if you were doing the complete lab report. If you're not doing a complete lab report, the points are going to end up being a little different. I think actually I'm probably going to change this method points. I'm probably going to make it 1 and then put another point into other. I'm still kind of deciding on that depending on how some of this goes. So let's say for the sake of argument right now, we're going to say the method is going to be switched to 1, and we're going to switch the other to 3. Now the other here, I want to make it a little bit more clear. This is just kind of the other stuff that's not explicitly related to writing the actual content of the lab. So for example, is the writing readable? Do you have a bunch of incomplete sentences? Do you randomly just have, weird, really bad typos where you've inserted 17 extra Z's into a word? If it's formatted in such a way I can't tell what is what, that would go into other. So, going through and spending a little bit time formatting. So if you have like 3 extra white pages, or you have 1 word and then a huge white page, and then you start the rest of your lab up, stuff like that, you can have points removed from the other portion of the lab report. So I guess never mind, I'll talk about that in a minute. So I want to just talk about quickly title and names. Title, you can simply call it the title of the lab report. So those will typically come, it'll say lab whatever number, and I'll have a title on it. You're welcome to just use that. If you want to be creative, go ahead and go for it. I've had a couple of pretty creative lab report names in the past. One of my favorites was somebody took Sir Isaac Newton and they photoshopped him to have copious amounts of gold necklaces, and they put a grill on his mouth but not a smile. So have some fun with it. Just please just at least somewhere make sure it's clear what the lab is. Be sure to include all names on the lab, so you are going to be able to work in pairs. I'm not going to allow groups of 3 or 4, 2, that's it, or by yourself. Be sure to include your names on the lab report. If you are working in a pair, it is your personal responsibility to make sure that your name is on the lab report. This is going to ensure that you receive credit for doing your work. If there's only a single name on there, I'm going to assume only a single person did it. Now, even if you work on the lab alone, I would like you to make sure that you put your name on the document. It's a good practice to remember to do this for when classes do return to person. So we're going to skip the abstract for a long period of the semester. I personally find the abstract is one of the hardest sections to write in a lab. And because basically what the abstract is the goal of the abstract is to hook the reader. How do I make the reader actually want to read the rest of my lab report? I don't really have a choice, and sometimes that does feel truly like a tragedy, because reading the same thing 12 to 25 different times can get a little rough, but your idea is to make it interesting. So typically the way the abstract works is it's about 1 sentence per main section of the lab. So when we're talking about main sections, that would be the introduction, so the general idea the lab covers, methods, the methods that here we're going to say you use really gently. Some of the labs, I will be giving you data, I will be doing the lab for you, so you're not doing it, I am, but is it experimental? Am I doing it in real life? Is it theoretical? Is it using a simulation? How are you doing this lab? And then results, what was the main result of your finding? So if, let's say, we're calculating the acceleration due to gravity, what was the actual value you calculated in your group? So that's typically what the abstract is. Now, when you write an abstract, a lot of the times it's the absolute last thing you end up actually writing for the lab. So that's why we're going to wait, and we're going to work on how do we create methods, or not methods, but how do we create nice results? How do we do a good introduction? How do we build up the main portion of the lab so that when it comes to the abstract, we know the general idea, the methods used, and our results. So that's why we're going to we're not going to be writing an abstract till probably the 4th or 5th lab in this class. So the introduction is a big number of, I think it's 3 points for the lab. And so what the introduction does is I think it should include 3 key aspects. First being, what is the primary physics topic in the lab? So that's going to be the general physical phenomenon. So what are you actually looking at exploring? And here, this is a good place to introduce equations that you're going to be using in the lab. So let's say we're introducing a term. If that term is defined with a mathematical equation, we can use that mathematical equation in conjunction with our word definition to explain the idea and its completion. And when we're introducing an equation, typically we're going to be using what is referred to as the basic form of the equation. So what is the conservation of energy equation? What is the equation for kinetic energy? Just really basically the definition equation that is included. You then want to talk about why is it important to study this topic. So the abstract has gotten me interested in reading the remainder of your lab. The introduction is telling me what am I actually focusing on in more details, and why should I care? Why should I care about gravity? Well, without gravity, nothing works the way it does. So that's a pretty good reason or way to explain why I should study gravity. So this could be a real world application. So in the sense of gravity, you could say gravity keeps you on Earth, keeps Earth orbiting around the sun. You know, things like that. That is a real world application. So you could do it that way. You can just anything kind of along those lines. It could be something you personally deal with on a day-to-day basis, or it can be something that just is really broad. Maybe in the individual field that you are interested in, this topic is important for a slightly different reason. So you want to include kind of why is it important, and you can decide how to approach that in a little bit more nuanced detail. And the last thing that is important to include in the introduction is your hypothesis. Now, with the hypothesis, you need to state what you think will happen and why. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of slides, some suggestions on how to go through and do that. So I just kind of want to, again, hit on these points for what I'm looking for in the introduction. And the reason I'm going to be doing this is a lot of the times the introduction, people include one or two, not necessarily all three of the things I'm looking for. So you're going to be losing points. Depending on how many sections of the introduction you've missed is going to determine how many points you have no chance of getting. So to determine the primary topic, a good way to do that is actually going to be reading the title of the lab. Usually it's pretty clear as to what that is. Or at the beginning of pretty much all of the lab reports, there's some text explaining what's going to be looked at. That would be another good way to figure out what's actually happening in the lab. So how do you describe it? So you can have a general definition or description of what it is. So if we're talking about gravity, what is gravity? Well, there's a couple of different things we can use to explain it, and we'll get through those throughout the remainder of the semester. But you know, it's a force, it's an attractive force, it's between mass, like different things that have mass, you know, depending on what exactly you're trying to explain would probably determine on how you want to go through with its definition or description. Again, you can use equations, being sure to identify your variables. That would be a way to describe it. You might want to look up a diagram or a graph. Now the textbook does have some pretty okay pictures. So if there's a picture from the textbook that you want for your lab report, you can just let me know and I can get you the file for that. So, but yeah, if you want to use a diagram or graph from the textbook, you can pull one from Google. That is perfectly fine. Yeah, so just you can, any way you want to describe the phenomenon, go ahead and use it. Where should you look for the information on how to describe the primary physics topic? Textbook, you can look online somewhere. The lab handout, lecture notes, just kind of anywhere that you want. In the case of using diagrams or graphs or using an online source, do not just copy and paste. If you're using text to try to help explain something, don't copy and paste it. Sit there and think about how can you take the words that are there and transcribe them in your own way. The way that I like to recommend doing that is read what you want to, that's what's relevant. Work on a different part of the lab for a couple of minutes, then come back and try to type it roughly from like the same ideas that you're looking for. And that way I'm going to take a wild guess that you can't memorize text that quickly and then remember it for 5 minutes. I know I sure can. So that's one way to do it. If you're using a diagram or a graph from another source, If it has a watermark, just keep it there. That's fine with me. If you get it from somewhere else, just put in parentheses, taken from this website, whatever that happens to be. So do some sourcing, but I'm not going to sit here and say you have to use MLA format or anything like that in order to cite your work. Why is it important to study this topic? Again, we want to answer the question of why should we care? Why would it be relevant to anything we do? Something with physics applies to you whether you like it or not. So does the physics topic we're explaining in class apply to you? If so, how? Where do you find this information? Personal experience, textbook. Again, you can look up stuff online, but just don't copy and paste it directly. Hypothesis. Again, we are explaining what we think will happen and why. So with the explanation of why, there's a couple of different things we can do. First, is this a definition or an accepted value? If it's an accepted value, so let's say we're trying to calculate the acceleration due to gravity, it has a value on Earth. So what you can say is, hey, we are expecting a value of 9.8 meters per second squared. This is the accepted value of gravity on Earth. Boom, done. Your hypothesis is explained. Maybe you introduced the reason why earlier when you were talking about the topic. So you could say, something along the lines of the conservation of energy as explained above can be used to state that whatever you happen to be stating. So, go through and try to make sure that you're explaining why you should see what you're saying for the hypothesis. All right, so for methods, I'm not going to be making you write up the methods section for the lab. The only thing I want you to include in the methods is if you make any decisions when performing the lab, to include them here. So one of the labs that I'm going to be doing later in the semester, I'm going to do the first part of the experiment, and then it's going to be making a decision. Do I use 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 centimeters? So I'm going to be doing that, and then I'm going to be doing the lab with all those settings. So with that, you're going to be choosing which 1 through 5, which centimeters results are you using. And you'll need to explain why you're doing that decision, and it would go here in the methods. Some of the simulations that I'm kind of considering looking at, you'd have to make a choice as to, what value did you use for friction, for example. So any decision you and your lab group, if you're working on, decide to use needs to be stated. So the results can be a pretty complicated part of the lab report. So I'm still working on a document. My goal is to get it out before the, I say the second lab because that's probably where you're going to need it. But I have a document. It is currently on Canvas that helps you with equation formatting and table formatting. But again, the graph one is it's taken a little bit longer, so that's going to go up later. But all of that is relevant for the results. The results is a lot of kind of practicing and a little bit of preference, but in either way, you need to include all recorded data during the time. And when I say all, there will be times where it explicitly tells you not to include all. So again, that experiment where I said there'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 centimeters, I'm not going to give you all the data because it's going to be over 100 pages of data. And I don't want that in your lab report. So when you're representing your data, it can be in a table, graph, or other method. In some situations, you just need one number. So if you're timing something, you can say it took this amount of time, so a complete sentence would work. But when you're doing this, make sure that it's clear what's in the table or what's in the graph. It shouldn't be like, okay, here's a graph and I have to try to guess what set of data it happens to be. If you have any abnormal results, try to think about why that might be the case and put it here. Some students have done experiments where there's one data point that's just way out of line of everything else. So why do you think that's the case? Oops. I copied this from my previous semester of it. I apparently didn't. We're not going to have signed results, so we're just going to ignore that. I fixed like 95% of these slides and not that one. So we're just going to ignore that part. So showing math. At some point, you need to have the basic equation for what you are personally going to be using. So whether that's in the introduction or here in the results is up to you, but it should always have the basic form of the equation. That's going to be the one you probably find in the textbook or is given to you in the lab handout. If the equation you end up using is from the basic equation, the best way to do that is show the basic and final forms. So that could look like something like this here. So here we are starting with the equation of a straight line. So here it's telling us the base form of the equation. Here it's numbered, so I could refer to it as equation 1. I'm not going to require you to number your equations, but other faculty may as you move through the equation. Following my equation, I have my variables that are spelled out. So here I have m, x, y, and b, and they are defined. Then it just says rearranging the equation, we get equation 2. Equation 2 is here where it's solving for b, which is what we are being told in this particular paragraph, what we're solving for. So you don't actually have to show the math of saying, hey, we're going to subtract mx from both sides. Assume again that your audience is in Physics 129, so they're in calculus, so that means we can assume they can do algebra. Something that really grinds my gears is when students show me actual math. When they take the numbers that they've defined their variables, they've put the numbers in a nice little table or something, and they said this is the equation we're going to be using, and then they plug the numbers into the equation and give me the results. Don't do that. It is a waste of time for formatting. It is unnecessary. Just put the resulting number in a sentence if you need to, or put it in another column. I don't need to see the math. If you show me the math and I'm not asking for it, and I will never ask for you to show me every single step of the math, I will deduct points from the other portion of the lab report grade. So do not plug in numbers and show me how you got to your answer. Do not do that. So tables, figures, graphs, whatever you want to have them, there's a chance you're going to have multiple. And because in the discussion, the next part of the lab report, we want to be specific as possible, it's going to be really beneficial to make sure that everything is labeled. So I could say, referring back to table 2, instead of saying the table above, when I have 4 tables, I don't know which table that is. So make sure that you label your everything that has data in it. So graphs, tables, figures, whatever you want to call them. So I'm going to tell you the traditional way in which this is done, and then I'm going to tell you what I'm expecting for in this class. So traditionally, graphs are labeled as figures. Figures are labeled below the figure and briefly indicate what is being shown. So that would be like figure 1, picture of my favorite animal, the red panda. Right? That would be the label is the figure 1. The description of it is the caption, and that just says, what am I looking at in this case? Position as a function of time. My best friend and I in 5th grade. Whatever, just a quick synopsis of what that particular figure happens to be. And again, this is traditional. Tables are labeled above the table and include a caption which states what's in the table. So again, table 1, monthly salary or whatever it happens to be. Now, I'm not going to be picky about where the title and caption are as long as they're included. So if you want to put everything above, that's fine. If you want to put everything below, that's fine. I don't care. Just make sure you put the label and you put the caption with, actually put it like not physically next to, but above or below the thing it is referring to. I say above and below. I really do not like the side ones because what it tends to do is it tends to squish your image and it makes it a little bit harder to read in a lot of situations. So I would heavily recommend above and below, but if you put it to the side, I'm not going to dock points off of that. So I would like to explain this figure for what it is here. So I am by no means an artist, which you'll find out. You find out right now, but you also will find out as the semester continues. So this is using a touchpad on my tablet. I am right hand dominant. So this is drawing a star with my dominant right hand with my eyes open. This figure on the right here, this top right hand corner, is my eyes open but with my left hand. If we go to this bottom left corner, this is my right hand again, but now my eyes are closed. And on this attempt of a star, in the bottom right hand corner, is my left hand with my eyes closed. So that's what this is. Now you'll see a Lab 0 quiz, and that's going to be asking you how would you label and caption this particular image. So go ahead, pause the video, go through and do that. All right, I'm going to assume you've done that, so I'm going to show you this one here is the longest winded version of what I would expect to see in your in the caption. Right, so it tells you what exactly I verbally said out loud. Here it's referring to dominant and non-dominant hands, and it tells you the direction in which to move. So top left clockwise, so I'm starting in this top left one and I'm moving around. So maybe this type of description works really well because I'm going to have one for every student of the class. I'm not, but let's say hypothetically that's what the lab was. Well, if that's the case, this could, in theory, work. Something else is, calling them super good art skills. That explains roughly accurately what that is. I can draw stars sometimes. Or you could just say it's step 4 of the lab. So maybe step 4 of the lab is this, and maybe step 5 is, you do it 65 times and then you do it on the 65th time, you do this. Sure. Whatever you want to call it, as long as it's, so I have my label, it's figure 1 in all of these, and then everything after that is my caption. So I've included a label and caption at multiple different levels for the same image. I don't care which one of these it is. Just give me something that accurately describes what is going on. Next, I want to just briefly go over some graph examples. Again, I do intend on giving you a graph kind of handout to help go through it. So here we have a title on it. We have our y-axis and x-axis labeled, and we have a key telling us what all the points are. So the x and y-axis and the key, these are probably some pretty good things to have in every graph we have. Maybe not the key, that's going to depend on what exactly we're using, but it's nice to have. The title we're not necessarily going to need, because what this title is it's a really good caption for what's being shown in the graph. So instead of putting a title, I could say this is, graph 3, randomly generated numbers. That would work as a label and caption for this particular graph. So you don't have to put titles. So something that's in this particular graph is a lot of white space. So by having all of this white space here, it makes it appear as though the randomly generated numbers can go from 1,200 all the way down to 0. And there's a really weird thing happening where everything seems to be, close to 800 here to 1,000. Well, the reason that's the case is I actually have a random number generator going from 750 to 1,000. So I'm never going to have data down here that results in actual generation. So it's beneficial then to not have all of this white space. Now in this class, because things are going to be turned in digitally, colors are a little bit less important. The default colors in Google and Microsoft tend to be semi-distinguishable, but if I'm being honest, this darkish brown and this whatever color that is, they're a little hard to tell apart. So what would probably be good is changing the colors. So here I've changed the graph, where I've changed the maximum and minimums so that it's a little easier to see that there's a distribution of my particular values. Again, we don't have anything between 750 and 700 or anything between 1,000 and 1,050. So we could cut it down a little bit more, but this just, maybe in my caption then, I state randomly generated numbers between 750 and 1,000. So because we don't have all of this white space, now we have an issue where our key is a little bit hard to read. So maybe that would be something, again, we move down into the caption. But so with graphs, again, I do intend on getting you a document to kind of help you out with graph generation. I just haven't, I'm not quite pleased with where it sits as of recording this video. So for the discussion, this is one of the other big sections of the lab. So the results were 5 points. I'm pretty sure the discussion is 5 points as well. I am looking for 3 things in the discussion. So first off, your discussion should contain no new results or calculations outside of a percent error. And I'll talk about that percent error in a second. So in the discussion, you should readdress the hypothesis. So mention what your hypothesis is. Don't make your reader go back up, read your hypothesis, and refresh themselves that way. So, mention your hypothesis again. So you don't have to do the whole thing, just say, we hypothesized that, whatever. End of sentence. We observed, whatever. Therefore, our hypothesis was correct, incorrect. That is how you can readdress the hypothesis. When you readdress the hypothesis, do not use terms big, close, small to describe how different your results are. So if the value I'm supposed to be getting is 1, and I actually get 2. The numbers 1 and 2 are really close together, right? They're in chronological order. However, if I'm only supposed to be getting 1 for my value and I got 2, that's a 100% error. How would you like it if you, at the end of class, let's say you had a 94%. And I said, oh, but there's 100% error on that. So in reality, you could have 194%, or you could have a -4%. Even though the numbers are close, the percent error there is huge. Maybe we're dealing with something where the answer is 10 million, but you calculated 10,100,000. That's 100 numbers different. That's kind of big. But the fact that we're dealing with a million, that percent error is going to be small. So it's beneficial to refer to the percent error if you are using a numerical, if you have a numerical hypothesis and solution. This is just going to be a lot more specific. So that's readdressing the hypothesis. Next, you should be linking the results in the introduction. I'm going to talk about that on the next slide, and then answer any questions in the lab handout. So sometimes the lab handout will have you answering a couple of different things. Answer those in complete sentences. Try to get it so that it's not just, do not include the questions. Don't say, 1 answer, 2 answer. Spend the time to answer these questions in a paragraph format. So, again, do not include the questions and do not just number the solutions. So briefly, just want to talk about how to link the results in introduction. So with this, there's a couple of different things that you can do. So you can explain what's observed and how it relates to the real world application you've talked about. So let's say you are talking about boats. You can say, well, this particular experiment shows us that boats will float because whatever. Maybe you can talk about when we're doing a simulation, it's ideal. We're not considering a lot of different situations. So how is it different? How is what you observe in the lab different from the real world? What are we ignoring when calculating something in the lab? Just talk about I guess it's a little hard to, what about the lab makes it, like what you observed in the actual lab relates to real world something or another. Again, be specific. Don't just say in the data or the graph above. Refer to the actual image or table or graph or again, whatever you're labeling them as. Say, where can I personally find this information? If you used a model in the introduction, discuss how the model in real life are different. So, for example, you model the kinematic equations. Well, the kinematic equations absolutely do not refer to drag. Real life has drag. Talk about it. The results don't match the theory because we don't account for X, Y, Z. Anything along these lines corresponds to linking what you observed to what you expect to observe. So the conclusion, the last thing this or the abstract are the last things you're going to write. The conclusion should include nothing new. Nothing new, it's just a summary. It's the nice little bow at the end. So you hook them in with the abstract. You gave them all of this information, and now you're like, and here's the too long you didn't read the rest of it. Here's a great summary of everything you just read. Here's the key points, the nice little bow on top that says, we're done. We're moving on. So I'm looking for something short. I only want 1 to 2 sentences. I'm not going to dock you if you give me 3 or 4 sentences, but if you give me a page-long conclusion, I'm going to dock you points for that. The conclusion should be short. Nothing new. Just don't copy paste your own work. Just summarize the lab in its entirety. All right, so that's kind of what I'm expecting in general from labs. Again, you're not going to be writing a full lab report for all labs, so don't stress about doing this right away. We are going to be spending time building up these skills. So you're going to write an introduction. I'm going to be able to provide you feedback before your next introduction. So I want to make sure that you're building up these skills because there's something you're going to be using for your rest of the time here at DVC in the physics track. And then just the general practice of communicating your work is something that is going to transcend into your career, whatever that happens to be. All right, so make sure you take the Lab 0 quiz thing. And then if you have any questions, let me know.